When people think of horror stories, they usually imagine haunted houses, abandoned hospitals, or dark forests. Few people imagine a hotel in the middle of a busy city. But in 2013, one downtown Los Angeles hotel became the center of one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern history. The story begins with a 21-year-old university student from Vancouver, Canada. Her name was Elisa Lam. In January 2013, Elisa decided to travel alone along the west coast of the United States. She was an experienced traveler who enjoyed documenting her journeys online. Her parents were supportive but cautious. To reassure them, Elisa promised she would call every day and keep them updated on her whereabouts. For the first part of the trip, everything seemed normal. She visited tourist attractions, took photographs, and shared details of her journey online. She appeared excited and optimistic about the adventure. On January 26th, she arrived in Los Angeles and checked into a hotel known today as Stay on Main. At the time, the building was still widely associated with its former name, the Cecil Hotel. The hotel already had a dark reputation. Built in the 1920s, it had witnessed decades of tragedy. Numerous deaths, suicides, and violent incidents had occurred within its walls over the years. Locals knew the building's history well. Many considered it one of the most unsettling hotels in America. But Elisa likely knew little about that reputation. To her, it was simply an affordable place to stay while exploring Los Angeles. For several days, everything appeared routine. Then something changed. On January 31st, Elisa was supposed to check out of the hotel and continue her trip. She never arrived at her next destination. More concerning was the fact that her daily phone calls home suddenly stopped. Her parents became worried almost immediately. This was completely out of character. When they could not reach her, they contacted authorities. Soon, the Los Angeles Police Department launched a missing person investigation. Officers searched the hotel. They questioned employees. They reviewed surveillance footage. They searched nearby areas. But they found nothing. No sign of Elisa. No evidence of an abduction. No indication of where she had gone. As days passed, concern turned into fear. Then investigators released a surveillance video from one of the hotel's elevators. Nobody expected what they were about to see. The footage begins normally. Elisa enters the elevator alone. At first, she appears calm. Then her behavior suddenly changes. She presses several buttons. She steps toward the hallway and looks outside. Then she quickly retreats back into the elevator. It appears as though she is hiding from someone. She presses herself against the wall. She peeks around the corner. Looks left. Looks right. But nobody is visible. The hallway appears completely empty. For nearly 4 minutes, Elisa continues behaving strangely. She repeatedly enters and exits the elevator. She makes unusual hand gestures. She appears to be talking to someone outside the camera's view. At one point, she stands in the hallway and moves her hands in a way many viewers later described as bizarre and difficult to understand. Eventually, she walks away. The video ends. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elisa Lam alive. The footage spread across the internet with incredible speed. Millions of people watched it. Forums filled with theories. Some viewers believed she was being followed. Others suggested she was frightened by someone standing just beyond the camera's field of vision. Some claimed the hotel was haunted. Theories became increasingly wild, but none of them answered the most important question. Where was Elisa? Days turned into weeks. Meanwhile, guests staying at the hotel began reporting strange problems. Several complained about low water pressure. Others said the water tasted unusual. Some reported discoloration. Employees investigated the complaints, but initially found nothing obvious. Eventually, a maintenance worker was sent to inspect the building's rooftop water tanks. The tanks supplied water to guest rooms throughout the hotel. When the worker climbed to the roof, he noticed one of the tank lids was open. Curious, he looked inside. What he saw would become one of the most shocking discoveries in modern true crime history. Elisa Lam's body was floating inside the water tank. The missing student had been found directly above the hotel guests who had unknowingly been using the contaminated water. News of the discovery shocked the world. Almost immediately, new questions emerged. How had Elisa reached the roof? How had she entered the tank? Why had nobody found her sooner? The rooftop was not intended to be easily accessible to guests. Investigators worked to reconstruct her final movements. The autopsy eventually determined there was no evidence of physical assault. Toxicology reports revealed no significant presence of alcohol or illegal drugs. Authorities ultimately concluded that Elisa's death was accidental. Investigators believed she had entered the tank herself. According to official findings, Elisa was experiencing symptoms related to bipolar disorder, a condition she had previously been diagnosed with. Records indicated she had not been consistently taking her prescribed medication during the trip. Experts suggested that this may have contributed to confusion, paranoia, or hallucinations during her final days. For investigators, this explanation fit the available evidence. But for many members of the public, the mystery never truly disappeared. The elevator footage continued to generate endless debate. Viewers scrutinized every frame. Some argued that her behavior suggested she was frightened. Others insisted she appeared to be communicating with someone unseen. Theories involving hotel employees, serial killers, and supernatural forces spread online. Documentaries were produced. Books were written. Podcasts analyzed every detail. Yet despite all the speculation, many experts continue to point toward the official conclusion. The tragedy, they argue, was not the result of a murderer or a ghost. Instead, it was the heartbreaking outcome of a mental health crisis that unfolded far from home. Still, the case remains deeply unsettling. Part of the reason is the elevator video itself. Human beings naturally search for explanations. When we see fear on someone's face, we want to know what caused it. When we watch someone react to something, we expect to see the source. In Elisa's case, the source remains invisible. The camera never shows what she was looking at. It never reveals what she was thinking. It leaves viewers trapped inside a moment they cannot fully understand. That uncertainty is what continues to haunt people. Years later, tourists still visit the building. Many know the story before they arrive. Some stay only because of the mystery. Others avoid the place entirely. The hotel's reputation has become inseparable from the events of 2013. For those who remember the case, the most disturbing image is not the rooftop water tank. It is not the police investigation. It is not even the discovery itself. It is the image of a young woman standing alone in an elevator, glancing nervously into an empty hallway. Because no matter how many years pass, nobody can watch that footage without asking the same question. What was she seeing? And that question may never be answered. When most travelers stop at a roadside motel, they expect only one thing: a quiet place to sleep before continuing their journey. The room may not be luxurious. The neighborhood may not be memorable. But the motel serves a simple purpose: a temporary shelter from the outside world. In November 2006, a small motel outside Atlantic City, New Jersey, became connected to one of the most chilling, unsolved murder cases in modern American history. The case would eventually earn a name that sounded as if it belonged in a horror novel: the Eastbound Strangler. What made the story especially disturbing wasn't just the murders themselves. It was the fact that nobody has ever been arrested. Nearly 2 decades later, the killer's identity remains unknown. The story began on a cold morning in early November. A maintenance worker was traveling near a drainage ditch behind a cluster of motels along the Black Horse Pike in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. The area was familiar to local residents. Several budget motels sat alongside the busy highway. People came and went constantly. Tourists, travelers, truck drivers, temporary workers. The constant flow of strangers made the area feel anonymous. Few people paid attention to who arrived. Even fewer noticed who disappeared. That morning, something unusual caught the worker's attention. At first, it looked like trash scattered near the water. But as he moved closer, he realized he was looking at human bodies. Not one, not two, 4. All 4 women had been placed side by side in the ditch. Each was positioned facing the same direction. The arrangement appeared deliberate, carefully planned. The scene immediately suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. Police rushed to the location. Investigators secured the area. Detectives began the difficult task of identifying the victims. The women were eventually identified as Kristen Lee Paul, Tiffany Bingham, Barbara Brader, and Lisa May. Although they came from different backgrounds, investigators quickly noticed similarities. Several had struggled financially. Several had spent time in the Atlantic City area. Several had worked in environments where they encountered strangers regularly. Most importantly, all four women appeared to have vanished without attracting immediate public attention. This fact deeply troubled investigators. Whoever committed the murders seemed to understand something important. People who lived on the margins of society often disappeared without generating the same urgency that surrounded other missing person cases. The killer may have believed that nobody would notice, or that nobody would care. The autopsies revealed another disturbing detail. All four women had likely been strangled. No obvious signs linked the murders to a specific suspect. No witnesses came forward with a clear description. No surveillance footage provided answers. The investigation immediately became one of the most difficult cases in the region. As detectives reconstructed the victims' final days, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Several of the women had spent time around the motels lining the highway. Those motels became a central focus of the investigation. The buildings themselves were not unusual. They looked like countless other roadside lodgings across America. A few parking spaces, rows of exterior doors, neon vacancy signs glowing through the night. But detectives soon realized that the very nature of motels created unique challenges. Guests arrived anonymously. Many paid cash, so stayed only a few hours. Others stayed only a single night. Names could be false. Addresses could be fake. A person could appear and disappear without leaving a meaningful trace. For a predator seeking victims, it was an ideal environment. Investigators interviewed motel employees. They questioned guests. They reviewed available records. But every lead seemed to dissolve. The area saw thousands of visitors every month. Finding one suspicious individual among so many strangers felt nearly impossible. As news coverage increased, fear spread throughout Atlantic City and neighboring communities. Residents began locking their doors earlier. Women traveling alone became more cautious. People wondered whether a serial killer was moving through the region unnoticed. The possibility seemed terrifying. The victims had not been discovered over a period of years. They had all been found together. This suggested the murders had occurred within a relatively short time frame. That realization raised an alarming question. If the killer had murdered four women so quickly, how many others might there be? Detectives pursued numerous theories. Some investigators believed the murders were the work of a local offender familiar with the motel district. Others suspected a truck driver or transient worker who regularly traveled through the area. Several persons of interest were examined. None could be conclusively linked to the crimes. Years passed. The investigation continued. Advances in forensic science brought occasional hope. DNA evidence was reviewed. Records were re-examined. Witness statements were revisited. Yet every new lead eventually reached a dead end. The case remained unsolved. For many people, the mystery became even more frightening with time. Most murder investigations eventually provide answers. An arrest, a confession, a conviction, something that explains what happened. But the Eastbound Strangler case provided none of those things. Instead, it left behind a collection of unanswered questions. Who selected the victims? Why were they placed together in such a deliberate manner? How did the killer avoid detection? And perhaps most unsettling of all, was the murderer ever caught for another crime? Or did they simply disappear back into ordinary life? Years after the discovery, journalists continued investigating the case. True crime researchers analyzed every available detail. Online communities debated theories endlessly. Some attempted to connect the murders to other unsolved crimes. Others argued the killer may have died before being identified. Despite the attention, certainty remained elusive. The mystery persisted. And that mystery transformed the story into something that feels almost like a horror tale. Imagine checking into one of those roadside motels in 2006. The neon vacancy sign flickers outside. Cars pass on the highway. The room seems ordinary. Nothing appears threatening. Nothing appears unusual. It's somewhere nearby. A killer may be watching, blending into the crowd, appearing completely normal, waiting for an opportunity. That possibility is what makes the case so disturbing. Real horror rarely announces itself. It does not always wear a mask. It does not always leave obvious warnings. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. The Eastbound Strangler case remains one of New Jersey's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The 4 victims deserve to be remembered not simply as names in a cold case file, but as human beings whose lives ended violently and whose families never received complete answers. Nearly 20 years later, investigators continue hoping that advances in technology may finally reveal the identity of the person responsible. Until that day arrives, the drainage ditch behind those motels remains the scene of a mystery that refuses to die. A place where 4 women were discovered. A place where a killer left a message. And a place where the most frightening question still has no answer. Who did it? Some horror stories begin with a scream. Others begin with a storm. This one began with a city on fire. In July 1967, Detroit, Michigan, was experiencing one of the most violent periods in its history. For 5 days, large portions of the city were consumed by riots, fires, looting, and chaos. Police officers were overwhelmed. The National Guard was deployed. Army troops entered the city. Gunfire echoed through neighborhoods day and night. Fear spread faster than the flames. People locked themselves indoors. Many believed that simply being outside after dark could get them killed. Amid this atmosphere stood a building known as the Algiers Motel. It was not a luxury hotel. It was not a famous landmark. It was simply a place where travelers, young people, and local residents occasionally rented rooms. On the night of July 25, 1967, several young people were gathered there, hoping to stay away from the violence erupting throughout Detroit. None of them could have imagined that the motel itself would soon become the most dangerous place in the city. As darkness settled over Detroit, reports began spreading about possible gunfire coming from the vicinity of the motel. Witnesses later provided conflicting accounts of exactly what happened. Some believed a starter pistol had been fired as a joke. Others heard sounds that they assumed were gunshots. In a city already overwhelmed by violence, any report of gunfire triggered an immediate response. Police officers rushed toward the motel. Members of the Michigan State Police arrived. National Guardsmen responded. The atmosphere was already tense before they entered the building. Everyone involved was frightened. Everyone expected danger. That combination would prove disastrous. When officers entered the motel, chaos quickly followed. Guests were ordered out of rooms. Individuals were forced against walls. Hands were raised. Questions were shouted. Nobody seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The officers believed they were searching for a sniper. The people inside insisted they had done nothing wrong. As the search continued, fear transformed into terror. Witnesses later described a scene that felt less like an investigation and more like a nightmare. Young men and women were separated. Some were struck during questioning. Others were threatened. Several later testified that officers conducted what became known as mock executions. Individuals were placed against walls and led to believe they were about to be shot. The purpose, according to later testimony, was to frighten them into revealing information. But the terror quickly escalated beyond intimidation. Inside the motel, nobody knew what was happening in neighboring rooms. People heard screams. They heard arguments. They heard footsteps moving through hallways. Most frightening of all, they heard gunshots. One after another, the sounds echoed through the building. Those who survived later described the helplessness they felt. Imagine sitting in a room, hearing a gunshot nearby, not knowing who fired it, not knowing who was hit, not knowing whether your turn is next. That was the reality inside the Algiers Motel that night. By the time the ordeal ended, 3 young African-American men had been killed. Their names were Carl Cooper, Fred Temple, and Aubrey Pollard. Several others have been physically assaulted. Many more carried emotional scars for the rest of their lives. As daylight arrived, the city slowly learned what had occurred. The official explanations raised immediate questions. Witness accounts often contradicted police reports. Survivors described treatment that shocked the public. Journalists began investigating. Civil rights organizations demanded answers. The deaths soon became one of the most controversial incidents of the entire Detroit uprising. Investigations followed. Public hearings followed. Criminal charges were eventually filed against several officers. Families hoped justice would be served. Survivors hoped the truth would emerge. But the legal process proved complicated. Witness testimony conflicted. Evidence was disputed. Trials stretched on. In the end, no officer was convicted for the deaths. For many people, that outcome deepened the tragedy. The families of the victims were left with unanswered questions. The survivors were left with memories they could never erase. And the city was left with an event that would remain controversial for decades. As years passed, the Algiers Motel itself disappeared. The building was eventually demolished. Today, visitors cannot walk through the hallways where the events occurred. The rooms no longer exist. The physical structure is gone, but the story remains. What makes the Algiers Motel killings feel like a horror story is not the presence of ghosts or supernatural forces. It is the atmosphere of fear that consumed the building. The people inside entered the motel believing it was a place of safety. Outside, Detroit was burning. Inside, they hoped to avoid danger. Instead, they found themselves trapped, unable to leave, unable to understand what was happening, unable to predict what would happen next. Survivors later described feeling as though the entire night lasted forever. Minutes felt like hours. Every sound became terrifying. Every opening door felt like a threat. Every footstep approaching the room caused panic. When human beings lose certainty, fear expands rapidly. Inside the Algiers Motel, certainty vanished completely. Nobody knew who was in control. Nobody knew whether they would survive the night. Those emotions continue to resonate decades later because they are universal. Anyone can imagine being trapped. Anyone can imagine hearing screams in another room. Anyone can imagine waiting for footsteps to stop outside their door. That psychological terror is what makes the story unforgettable. More than half a century has passed since the events of July 25, 1967. Many of the people directly involved are gone. The motel itself is gone, but historians still study the case. Journalists still investigate it. Documentaries continue to revisit the events. The story remains important because it demonstrates how quickly fear, confusion, and power can combine to create tragedy. The Algiers Motel was supposed to be a refuge. For those inside, it became something else entirely. A place where panic ruled. A place where trust disappeared. A place where 3 young men lost their lives. And a place that remains one of the most disturbing motel-related tragedies in American history. Even today, when people discuss the darkest nights in Detroit's history, the Algiers Motel is still remembered. Not because of what the building was, but because of what happened inside it. And because for those trapped there that night, the horror was real.